tons of useless power, banana compensating swing arms, the general disregard in terms of body integrity. This is how a lot of people might describe the sport of hill climbing. And some of those motorcycles do look odd, to say the least, and that made me curious. We see these extreme videos of daredevils launching their bikes up vertical faces, but how does it work? What's the story behind everything? This is a deep dive into motorcycle hill climbing. First thing anyone would notice is the extended swing arms. On the face of it, they tend to look kind of sketchy, but in order to understand them, I brought in Kegan from Goon Climbers, a guy who's been around the sport for longer than I even knew it existed.
Stock length dirt bikes, there is, an actual limit to what you can do with them.
You see, even for the best hard enduro riders, some climbs will simply present limitations.
There are individuals like Graham Jarvis and Taddy, all these guys that can take a stock length dirt bike up anything and anywhere, but even those guys, after a certain distance and steepness, the stock dirt bike has its limits.
And one of them is obvious: the tendency to constantly wheelie when facing up. And that's what extended swing arms prevent. Pretty obvious, right? Sure. But there are a couple not so obvious aspects. For one, these extensions can wildly vary in length, from a few centimeters to, the sky is the limit really. Quite literally sometimes. The trade-off is obvious. Short extensions will allow you to still trail ride, while the more extreme ones won't. But here comes the part that's not so obvious. Sure, longer swing arms give you stability, but they also take away a really important factor: traction.
When you take a stock wheelbase dirt bike and your butt's over the seat, that's traction. When you add 6 inches onto it, your weight is pushing down on the bike, and then your tires coming off the ground, not literally, but the pressure applied.
You see, normally, your own weight sits fairly close to the rear wheel, and so more pressure is exerted on that tire. But when you move that wheel further back, less and less pressure is directed towards the rear end. And so, sure, your bike won't wheelie, but you might also not go that far. In reality, it's a pretty delicate balance, and a balance that can vary greatly from hill to hill. What these modifications also mean is that riders sometimes have to lengthen the rear brake line. But what might seem counterintuitive is that some people remove the rear brakes altogether. This sounds crazy until you really think it through. Look, when going up, as we said, the rear loses traction. And that effect becomes even worse on downhills, up to the point where the rear becomes more of a steering mechanism than one of slowing down. So, at some point, having a rear brake becomes pointless, since you could also turn off the engine and control the braking with your clutch. That's actually a technique used in hard enduro too, on the super slow and steep descents. The other obvious elephant in the room are the engines. Nitrous 1000cc super sport power units, twin engines. We've really seen it all, and while those builds attract the views, the story isn't as simple.
A lot of it is just curiosity with those bikes. They do it just because it's cool and wild and attracts spectators.
In reality, for most people, a 450cc 4-stroke is more than enough. Some do prefer their 2-strokes, mostly in an older 500cc flavor.
They're more than likely going to be on a CR 500 or a KX 500, just because, when you get into hill climbing, you always want to have a bigger and better motor.
But realistically, you don't need more power than that. So, with that being said, why do people competing in the open class build those monster machines capable of producing ridiculous horsepower numbers? Funny enough, a lot of the times the answer might surprise you. Because they can. Because it's fun and crazy. No, seriously. In fact, on some technical hills, the 450s might even do better.
A lot of your time on the West Coast hill climbs and series out there, the hills are so technical, your 450 times are sometimes faster than the open bike time.
Realistically speaking, those huge turbocharged monsters are great at going fast in a straight line. And that's it. For some hill climbs, that's exactly what you need, but for many others, it's not that simple. And that's why, in the big competitions, it's not necessarily a rule that the bigger and faster the bike, the better the end result. Sure, in the sport, weight doesn't really play that big of a factor, but maneuverability can. Sometimes it's important, sometimes not so much. What is important is you considering hitting that subscribe button. Cheers. It's hard to think that safety comes into the mind of these guys at all, really, but it sometimes does. That's why some competitions mandate a different type of kill switch. These systems are similar to jet skis, in the sense that they tether the rider to their own motorcycle. In a lot of these climbs, the riders end up separated from their machines, so in order for the bikes to not shoot up on their own, these systems are favored. In fact, this is just one of the curious systems required by international competitions. This is the rulebook for the 2018 French Impossible Mountain Championship. For a motorsport competition, I will say it's severely light, but it does hide some gems in there that I bet you didn't know about. For one, the hills themselves have to be around 90% inclination, and even exceed 90% in select places. In these competitions, riders have two main goals: to get as far as possible, as quickly as possible. Every run is timed and measured, and the course could vary from 100 meters to just 250 meters start to finish. But one thing to note, these courses are actually pretty narrow, spanning from between 4 and 10 meters wide. And here comes the crazy part. The regulations say that a rider must be in contact with his machine when crossing the finish line. So, remember all those last chance motorcycle throws right before the finish? Yeah, those don't count. Okay, so let's say none of the riders get up. And yeah, that has happened a few times. Since time can't be a factor, the judges will look at the distance traveled. And this distance is measured from the start line to the place where the motorcycle stopped. So you see all those crazy bails where riders jump off their machines and their steeds barrel roll down the hill. Those basically don't count. The only thing that counts is where that bike stops tumbling. There is a small exception to this. If the bike exits the track, the point of exit will be taken as the measuring spot. So, according to these rules, throwing your bike can be worth it, just make sure to throw it off the track. Crazy stuff. Now, this rulebook also presents some interesting technical regulations. These apply for this particular French championship, but hear me out. The motorcycles can actually have as many wheels as they want, as long as they're inline. So, theoretically, there's nothing stopping you putting 4 rear wheels, for whatever reason. As mentioned earlier, having a rear brake is simply a recommendation, but not mandatory. What is mandatory is the engine, which has to be 601cc or bigger. That's why a lot of those French videos actually feature these monsters. They have to run high-powered machines, by the rules. To be fair, there is one way to have a sub 600cc bike, and that's by having multiple engines. So, technically speaking, you can't have a Yamaha R6 engine because that would be too small. But you could have two CRF 250 engines running at the same time. Make it make sense. Oh, and you've probably figured this out already, but no, there is no limit on the number of engines a motorcycle can have. Obviously, some things are really different in the hill climbing world than in my world, which mostly consists of hard enduro and rallying. But some others are more similar than you'd expect. Front suspension setups are usually pretty standard, and actually so are the rears. Most people would simply adjust some clickers, maybe put a stiffer spring and slow down the rebound, but that's pretty basic stuff. And even on the open class monsters, sure, you could use a suspension specialist, but that's about it. I mean, heck, we do that stuff for enduro riding too, with slightly different settings. Where my bikes and hill climb machines start to really differentiate themselves is in the tire department. For the inner side, this is mostly standard stuff, mousses, tubeless, tubes, you know, the regular. But for the tires themselves, for one, soft tires are a must. Remember, the extended swing arms rob the motorcycle of traction, so they have to compensate with the tire setups. The next step would be some drilled studs into those tires. So far, it's all pretty tame. But then you get to the interesting stuff. The next step is introducing bolts through the tire with washers and everything. Then you can use a pedal tire with those bolts. If that's not enough, how about wrapping a chain around the wheels or even metal scoops? That escalated pretty quickly, didn't it? Contrary to popular opinion, yes, you do want grip, but that doesn't mean that sometimes you don't want to spin the rear tire. Kind of like riding in mud. This technique can vary quite a lot from one hill climb to another, and speaking of technique, on the face of it, it is pretty similar to a hard enduro hill climb. You give it gas, modulate the power by slipping the clutch, and pick your lines as you go. In a sense, it's not that different. With one major exception: body positioning.
The stock length bikes, you want to be in the middle of the seat close to the gas tank. The stretch bikes, you want to lean back as far as you can. As far as you can the whole time. It's crazy. On regular dirt bikes, we tend to sit towards the middle to front of our motorcycle on steep uphills. And that's simply to prevent the front wheel from coming up. But with a stretched bike, that's no longer an issue. Yet remember, grip is. So maybe a bit counterintuitive, but a lot of hill climbers will actually lean back on a bike when going up. If you ask me, that would be a habit I might have trouble picking up. The reality is, it's hard to say definitive things about the sport, because it's so varied. On its mild side, a few $100s will get you some swing arm extensions and you're good to go. But on the other hand, for a full open class build, you can expect to pay anything up to $50,000. And at that level, the engineering that goes into those builds can make the difference in the real world. If you just hack a bike together and build it, it's going to be all wonky. With the right builders and getting the engines up the right height and everything, if they build it right, it's just phenomenal.
The more I dive into the sport, the more complex it gets. But it didn't used to be that way. Henry Ford once said that auto racing began 5 minutes after the second car was built. And it's a similar situation with hill climbing. In fact, it is one of the oldest motorized two-wheeled sports. It all started in the early 1900s, when manufacturers would create events to showcase the power of their motorcycles. Indian were one of the first at it, inviting the public to see what their bikes could do on a hill next to their Massachusetts factory. With time, this became more of a show, an event, and other manufacturers joined in, like Harley, Excelsior, and even Triumph. From what was a simple demo day, it was quickly becoming a full-on competition to show who builds the best motorcycles. As Harley started competing more and more, they also began dominating the sport. And one event transformed into 2 and 3, and more of those were popping up across the US. Take Capistrano Hill in Orange County, an event that went from having an audience of a couple hundreds to over 20,000 people by the early 1920s. And this was a bit of a defining moment for the sport. At this time, riders started modifying their machines, giving them more and more power, adding longer swing arms and a bunch of different other mods. You see, until then, hill climbing didn't look like today, because the bikes weren't powerful enough to loop out. But as the 30s were approaching, things were changing. And in 1929, they really changed, as Harley came out with their first dedicated factory hill climber, the DAH, or DAH, however you call it. Nowadays, this is more of a rare museum piece. Only about 30 were ever made, but this motorcycle changed the game. Fortunately, something else soon was going to change the game. And that's the Great Depression.
A financial panic grips the world.
With it, the sport went on a decline and stayed there for a number of years. The interest shifted from extreme motorized sports to, well, survival. And it took over 30 years to recover. But then, in 1971, one of the most iconic motorcycling movies came out on any Sunday. This one masterpiece reignited the passion of motorcyclists for the sport. You can actually check it out for yourself in the description below. As the sport resurrected into life, the AMA held the first officially sanctioned event in 1976. But funnily enough, this is one story of its origins, and I'm not actually sure it's the only one. You see, traces of hill climb competitions can also be found in France, dating as far back as 1897 in La Turbie. Somehow, the sport evolved in parallel in two different countries, in two completely different parts of the world. Even to this day, the French and the Americans are still the two strongest pillars of the sport. A sport that, at its core, has lived for over 100 years. And you know what? It makes sense. In essence, hill climbing is the most basic of two-wheeled motorsports. One bike, one rider, and one hill. The fastest man up the hill wins. And that's exactly what makes it so iconic. It's a sport where factory teams can compete with Joe and his uncle, while racing at the same level. I know for myself, from now on, when watching clips from these madmen, I can definitely appreciate it more for what it is and what it used to be.
We have a website, it's called goonclimbers.com. There you'll find Goon Climbers hats, hoodies, and merch, as well as I have a free training out right now. TikTok, Facebook, YouTube. We're on all the socials, and you can email us at goonclimbers@gmail.com.